You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskins, your host as always, and as we do with Brendon Ptolomey after we have a look at the Perth property market, we head out to the regions because they're just as important to us as the Perth property market. Many of us have an investment property there, a holiday home. We live there. Many of the listeners who listen in are just as interested in the regions as the city. And it is an interesting conversation to have because we can juxtapose the pressures of demand, supply and affordability from Perth with the regions as well. Brendo, thanks for coming in again, mate.
Yeah, cheers, Trent. Thanks for having me. Great to be here in 2025.
Talking about the regions.
One thing that I noted in terms of population growth this year, so Perth Metro got to 2.3 million people. Greater Western Australia is 3,030,000 people now. So there's 730,000 people living in regional WA, and that number grows all the time. So predictions of immigration and population growth into Perth Metro, that also flows out into the regions in terms of people moving to WA from East Coast, and we talked about Kiwis moving to WA from further East Coast. But then you've also got that migration that happens naturally from within WA of people moving for lifestyle type reasons or affordability type reasons or family reasons, getting out of Perth Metro and into part of regional WA.
Getting away from the family, you mean?
Might be getting closer or further away.
I could posit it's actually a lot of those things put together. I think I've seen a lot of people moving not only for the initial reason of maybe the lifestyle, just getting out of the big city, but also cost of living lower in a lot of places, and then got a great job as well.
Yeah. So all of those factors come in. This fundamentally is West Australian economy growing at an exponential type rate, and we'll look at a few of these towns as we go through in terms of how they're underpinned. We've had some challenges in 2024 with some of essentially the minerals that we extract in WA. Lithium's been in real trouble, nickel and copper in real trouble. I think that that's a big story for our economy in that we've just kept going.
We haven't fallen off a cliff, have we?
We haven't fallen off a cliff. The people that were employed in those industries have been gainfully employed in other sectors and essentially redeployed. That is the definition for mine of a really strong economy, a developed economy, one that has moved into a phase that we probably always aimed for. Lithium essentially almost collapses, and there are jobs for people in other industries and the demand for them there. And essentially they probably haven't changed wage too badly, and probably
it's been
haven't
a good litmus test, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. So if we, in terms of going around the regions, maybe start, because I think this sums up what we're talking about here, and if we start by going out to Kalgoorlie, which is unusual for us. We don't usually start out there. I just thought it was worth going out there because of the fact that it brings in those themes. And one of the most interesting stories that came out towards the end of last year was that employment story. Essentially the gold industry saying, we will take all of those people that have come out of nickel and copper. We've got jobs for them tomorrow. Same with the lithium guys, that the skill set might be a little bit different, but we'll take them into our marketplace. And the reason why I thought we'd start in Kalgoorlie is it covers a few different things. People like the super pit out there don't like employing FIFO workers, so that creates that real local connection to town. It then drives the property market within town because they've got a certain number of locals that have to live, work and create that amenity that comes with a population based locally in Kalgoorlie.
They want stability as well.
Yeah.
So you start to buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's really solid activity happening out there at the moment, right across the board. Best value is sitting in around the $600,000 to $850,000 type range. That's where the locals are trying to buy a decent quality product and buy themselves a lifestyle within town. Investors are still really active there, and they're really active because essentially the yield looks really high against other locations across the country, and we're talking about yields in the order of 10% plus.
Are these East Coast investors or Perth people?
So they're locals, as in Kalgoorlie investors, they're Perth people, and they're East Coast investors right across the board, and they're putting pressure on values there as well. And of course, if we're saying that yields are good, we're going to be saying that rentals are pretty solid as well. So we're still getting really good rental returns for the lower end of value stock in there. And we're talking about the fact that you can buy a house in Kalgoorlie, or a unit, in Kalgoorlie, would be a house on a small lot, for numbers that are around $200,000 that are still renting at really healthy rents, $300 plus a week. So this will be a theme as we go through other locations across the regional summary, but there's a real issue in terms of creating supply of established accommodation, single residential or unit accommodation. Essentially, there's a new industrial estate out there that creates some commercial accommodation, but also some new residential subdivisions out there that essentially are selling out really quickly. So go and try and find a established dwelling. When they can't find that, they end up looking to build their own place as well.
Speaks to, I think, this the general theme of the struggle we have in Western Australia right now, and has always been the struggle, is that demand via population growth turns on and off fairly quickly. It's fairly dynamic, really, based on the economy and based on people wanting to live here for lifestyle reasons wherever in the state they want to live. But we don't have, and don't seem to have had for a long time, an ability to respond to that from a supply side. And it seems even more chronic in the regions than it is in Perth.
Yep, that comes down to the availability of trades in those local locations. To be brutally honest, if you're going to build a single residential dwelling in a regional location, you really need the builder to be living in town. It's not really a FIFO type operation in terms of the number of trades required to build a single residential dwelling. One of the things that we think will be a theme of 2025 is more modular housing. We've advanced a couple of brands there, and there's more than a couple, but there's a few.
Which brands are doing well?
So the guys at Peak or Fox Modular, they seem to have their processes sorted out in terms of being able to create products. They're telling me that they can have a livable dwelling, as in ready to occupy on site in most regional locations in WA within 10 months. I know that sounds like a long period of time, but they're talking about that being total construction time and planning approval, everything connected.
It sounds all right compared to what it would take to build a normal home now, but it sounds like a pretty poor outcome compared to what it would have been in 2017 anywhere in Perth or Western Australia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that quite interesting?
Yeah.
And then celebrating 10 months is a really efficient time frame.
Yeah, and I think there's some expectation management probably happening with that number. So to the other end of the scale, it's really interesting that Summit's Modular Homes division are essentially quoting 16 weeks to build. So they're gone to the other end of the scale and said, well, we can build this thing really quickly, but they're probably being cognizant of the fact that it's going to be a different case scenario in terms of delivery to different locations, and so they're not quoting that gross period of time. So the answer probably lies between 4 months and 10 months in terms of getting that on site. I think the most important bit is we've got a maturity of that product now. I'd encourage people that are in that regional marketplace to consider what those options are and take a look at the product.
What about the absence of just any other options? There are some areas, some regional places where there just aren't any builders. And you have to bring a modular home in on a truck down the highway.
Yeah, and I've heard multiple stories down Bremer Bay Way. There's some really great land available and being bought up down that coastal location. Obviously, it's a long way from Perth, and this is the type of solution that's being used wholesale in those subdivisions now, because Bremer Bay doesn't have, surprise, surprise, a local builder that's going to build your house.
Bremer Bay Homes.
Yeah. The Dale Alcock of Bremer Bay does not exist.
Yeah.
I think that'll be a trend in terms of the ability to create supply. Now, just a caution to listeners, if you think that the word modular means that you're going to save a whole lot of money or that it's going to be cheaper, that's just not going to be the case. It's still a relatively expensive product to build.
Why?
I think we just go back to demand and supply of labour, of trades. You still have to pay those rates to get those people to come and build the house in the factory anyway. So that may be a little bit cheaper because they're on site and they literally from one house to the next walk across a yard to do the plumbing on one building.
It might be more efficient to do it.
So it's more efficient.
But you're putting
save
the same
some money
things
there.
in the home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the time saving you have there is then probably outweighed by the things like essentially transport costs, those types of scenarios, as well as getting the site ready in the remote location. They're all going
costs,
to be
all those things,
they'll be more expensive than building in Perth Metro. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've digressed a little bit, but point on Cal is still going fairly strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And diversifying.
Need supply. And so that theme carries over if we go down into the Great Southern region, go to bomb on down the highway to the coast, as lots of people from Kalgoorlie might do when they go on holiday. Great Southern's had a really positive 2024, very active in terms of all of those locations down there, in particular Albany and Denmark. Interestingly, some of the locations, places like Mount Barker, Kendanup and Kojonup are really filling up with Perth expats in 24 and into 25.
Are these people second homing or are they moving?
No, so I think there's a lot of lifestyle options happening here. So people cashing out of, say, Perth Metro, downsizing or relocating from a lifestyle point of view into these locations. locations. And I think it's not just the baby boomer type generation retiring, it's also young families looking for a more affordable location. Is it okay to say a more old-fashioned, country style lifestyle? I'm going to go live in Denmark and be able to
call it the Instagram lifestyle.
Yeah. Yep. And then we go back to post-COVID because this stuff continues to build as...
It surprises you, do you reckon? Do you reckon? I would have thought because in the same way we saw Broome have a huge bubble and then go, we don't all need to go to Cabell Beach this year.
Yeah. Yes.
It surprised me a little bit that we're in 2025 and the water is still boiling white hot.
Yeah. So my take on this is maturity. So Perth Metro is maturing and suddenly 2.3 million people live here, and the concept that you were going to be able to, say, buy into just about any suburb that you desired has evaporated really quickly during 2024. So the same type of scenario is happening here in terms of people looking around and going, hey, hang on, this is actually viable. My friend that I thought was slightly crazy post-COVID for moving to a regional location and thinking they could manage their job from there.
They're happy.
They're happy. They're still there. It's still working. Yeah. And I was sort of halfway there back in 2023, procrastinated in 24 or I made a decision, and now we're into a zone where people can see that it's viable.
Yeah.
And with every person or family that moves to those locations, it makes it more viable for the next person.
It's more of a vibrant town.
Yeah, exactly. And so the local school gets filled up. So therefore, they need 2 teachers instead of 1. The local coffee shop's twice as busy as it used to be. So it's actually just viable to stay open all year round and through the Christmas, New Year period, and they're always there. And then the coffee's affordable or better quality, or the baristas are better quality because they've moved to town because it's now cool. So those things just feed on themselves. And I think Great Southern is a great example of where a really good economy crosses over with really good lifestyle opportunities, and people look at that and go, look, I can go and affordably live in that location and get the benefits that I was seeking.
And to the extent that we probably have less supply capacity now in these regional areas than 30, 40 years ago, a lot of those old blokes have retired. It doesn't take a lot of new population to cause big price increases. Maybe the answer is it hasn't actually been phenomenal amounts of population increases. It's just there are population increases, and it doesn't take a lot for the prices to go up, because I think in many of these areas, it's not that we're not building much. We're not building anything.
So on the balance in reverse to Cal, I mean, I know that Cal's got some local builders there. Albany has a larger number, as do Denmark in terms of local builders, but they simply cannot create enough new supply into that marketplace that's required in terms of the population shift there.
Well, I know Albany, for example, I'm being sent a land subdivision there just in North Albany. It's the first one that's happened outside of Dev WA for years. And it's tough to get that done in the first place.
Yep.
But people are buying them because there aren't really any other options.
Yes.
Unless you want an old weatherboard shack.
No, well, that's descriptive of the change in those locations in terms of demand, and the issue that, as we do have with local councils in Perth Metro, those councils aren't that nimble in terms of helping that supply come to market. Could be really challenging for them in terms of new concepts, and so it takes a fair amount of time to create the ability for the new product to come along.
Yeah, if you think people in Perth don't like change, go down to the regions. So approving a subdivision, imagine approving an apartment development in Dunsborough, for example, like we've seen recently.
Yep.
These things are even harder than you've seen in Perth if you're in the development space.
Yeah, and so swinging from Albany, Denmark, Great Southern round into the southwest, or Douth, I think we've confirmed that now. I reckon the Bunbury Outer Ring Road means that because we're bypassing Bunbury, that whole Margaret River, Dunsborough, Bustleton just becomes its own region called Douth.
You've been cooler than me forever, Brendon, so you can call it that.
Let's just remember back into 2024, mid to late 24, people were saying that it was overpriced, that it had done its dash, there was no more demand coming. Really what we're seeing is that pressure on price within those locations continues. Interesting data point in terms of, this is a Rewell whole of Southwest median house price, went up by 66% from 2019 to 2024, so 374k to 620k.
Well, that would track Perth.
Yeah, and so just underpins the fact that the activity and value growth down there has been as strong as Perth. I think the lifestyle type options in terms of wanting that second dwelling and wanting the holiday home, sorry to bring up COVID again, but it does come off the back of that, of everyone having that aha moment about their favourite location outside of Perth and within Western Australia.
Well, they went and visited it.
Exactly.
I know that, for example, I went to Albany for the first time in COVID because there was nowhere else I could go. I'd usually be overseas or something.
Yep.
And I fell in love with the place. I went to Mandurah and Falcon and these places and looked at the canals and spent some time there and thought, I bloody love these places. I should buy a holiday home. I didn't because I'm not so emotional about my investment decisions, but I was close.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've just been down south over Christmas, New Year. I haven't bought anything down there. I've got something in Exmouth instead, but similar type of situation. I'm driving around thinking, I should have bought something down
you
here.
do. Yeah.
Luckily, my sister and brother-in-law, thanks Benno, for having a nice place for me to stay at. Essentially, that market's still really strong, and that sentiment remains in terms of it being an active node. So Dunsborough as busy as ever over Christmas, New Year period. The fundamentals that starts creating that next level of amenity in town. So amazing restaurants. We obviously know the wine region through there. More and more cafes being opened. I experienced in the lines through Dunsborough in terms of just trying to get a coffee in between Christmas and New Year. Funnily enough, the coffee shop on the ground floor of the brand new apartment building in Dunsborough there, lines out the door. So in terms of locals saying this is not the development we need, well, the tourists and probably the locals in there too are saying, yes, this is what we do need. So those values are not going backwards anytime soon in those locations. This plays out into Busselton, down into Margaret River, and even down into Augusta as well in terms of there's not a wholesale amount of supply coming there. People have experienced really good outcomes in terms of having invested for their holiday home in those locations over the last couple of years. They've used it over the holiday period and they're there to stay. They're getting really involved and enjoying those locations and remaining or going on holiday within their own state.
Well, we think about how supply could come in there, right? As you said, there's one apartment building that was built in Dunsborough ever.
Yep.
That recently came in. There's no more planned, so there's no more apartments that are coming in anywhere in the southwest. So it has to be land. And where's the land coming in? Well, there's a bit coming in South Margaret River. We know that.
Yep.
Does that change the face of pricing, take pressure off pricing? I'm not sure. So I think there's probably some risk on the Margaret River side. Go to Dunsborough. There's a small amount with I think 2 subdivisions coming off just off Buswell Highway there. Busselton, not much at all. Certainly no apartments. So I think, again, dynamic point here, if it's not going to be affordability because most of the prices are lower, if not irrelevant with second homes, comes to dynamic of demand and population growth. So it really, I think there will be an extremely high correlation between prices in the southwest and population growth. If population growth goes up more than 0, prices stay up more than 0. If it starts to drop, you do start to see people move out pretty quickly. Yeah. So we're really just tracking that one number, it's population growth, because it's not supply.
Yeah. And one thing that we do need to talk about in terms of, like, Busselton's obviously an established and mature market for locals. I think what we've seen is in terms of in this generational change in Dunsborough is the fact that it is now has a very large permanent population through that location that will continue to underpin values in that area. So if the holidaymakers bailed out, there's actually locals that would step in to buy the luxury type property.
Okay, good to know. Let's move up the coast.
Yeah, so up to Bunbury. So real challenge for Bunbury here in terms of remaining relevant in that holiday makers market. So obviously the outer ring road is finished.
It's a bypass.
The bypass is there. It's called a bypass. Been up and down it a few times now. Really interesting that you put roundabouts on a highway, in my opinion, or a freeway. I suppose there's some logic in that.
It's cheaper than an overpass.
Yes, obviously cheaper than an overpass. So how does Bunbury adjust? Does it become a sleepy town? It's got its own very well-established economy. It's a centre of economic development through that location. Interesting, our team is saying that despite the challenges of the lithium mine down the road and the cancellation of the expansion of trains 3 and 4 at Kemerton, that's really bad news usually for a local town, but essentially property market's still been solid on the back of that. Supply is still relatively restricted and demand is still relatively healthy. So
is that an opportunity then in 2025 if the lithium price starts to come back, activity starts to come back in, people start to get employed again? Is that just an upside?
Yeah, and so let's remember that the Greenbushes mine is, I think it's one of the oldest continuously operating mines in the world because it used to be a tin mine.
Yep.
And it also is one of the cheapest cost to produce lithiums. And they've got some exceptional contracts around the world. So it still needs to remain in operation. It's very unlikely that it closes down. And essentially, the workers that are there, number one, having employment, and number two, need accommodation. So we would expect that underpins some of that, a portion of the Bunbury market. Interesting to note some commentary from our local valuers down there that some of the outerlying residential areas of Bunbury, for example, Dale Yallup, not dissimilar to what we said about outerlying areas of Perth, will have the challenge in terms of holding up value into 2025. So essentially might have been oversold a little bit, values have increased a little bit too quickly, and will struggle to sustain that into 2025.
Is that because there are better suburbs in Bunbury, places that people would prefer to be? What are those suburbs?
They will move back into the Bunbury type locations, as in on the fringes, so East Bunbury, down even into West Busselton's, I mentioned, even down to Old Broadwater. There are other options that they will go to from a price point of view and maybe a slightly better locational point of view as well.
Okay, so these are areas that have better amenity than a Daliala. What about Nostril Inn? Do people be moving around there as well?
A significant part of the bypass, if you think about those traffic lights on your way through Eaton and Nostril Inns, so I think that probably goes back to that northern suburb profile of Bunbury, relatively affordable place to live, has its own community aspect going. I always think of those locations a bit like Ellenbrook to Perth. It's got a price point, probably not going to experience any out-of-cycle growth as we go into 2025.
That is all the southwest, but we haven't done the north yet, have we?
So yeah, we go north of Perth now, Trent, and go up to Geraldton, which is a really interesting scenario at this point in time. So we've talked across the Perth podcast about the influence of buyer agents into our marketplace. And so when we talk about them swinging through a location and influencing values in a location, that's exactly what's happening right this minute.
Buyer agents are going to Geraldton.
Yes. Didn't I tell you that before we pressed record?
No.
So, yeah, look, I know you're surprised. And so let's go back to fundamentals. What's driving this? It's affordability, as in you can buy a property in Gero in some of those suburbs at $200,000 and $300,000. And so the buyer agents see that low price point. This is exactly what they did in Armidale. The rentals are really healthy in there in terms of they're more healthy than Perth Metro. The demand is there in terms of that rental side of the economy. So they've gone and looked at fundamentals and said, right, cheap capital value, no vacancy, as in very, very low vacancy rate, healthy demand for rentals, and therefore rents are going up. Put those two things together, you get a great yield, and I'm going to go and buy in that town.
I'll have to apologise to the people of Geraldton, but I've genuinely struggled to understand what is the driver here for population growth. I understand, like every other part of Western Australia, supply is tight, reasons we've spoken about. So there's that part sorted. Again, therefore, the only reason price rises is affordability, cool.
Yep.
But demand. There has to be increase in population. Why, Brendon, are people moving to Geraldton and therefore increasing demand and therefore increasing price in a place like Geraldton? You have an answer very easily for Kalgoorlie, for the southwest. We know why the northwest would have it, but why Geraldton?
Yeah, so essentially this is a little bit like we talked about with Denmark in terms of population growth has fed on itself. So a little bit of post-COVID people looking for new opportunities, looking for an affordable place to live, finding a coastal lifestyle that they're happy with. Then some of that local economy, i.e. there was demand for employment there, as in there were jobs available and people started filling those. And then that spins up slightly in terms of creating an economy that puts pressure on house values.
Yeah, I still struggle with it, mate. Like I've never heard personally, I'm not having a go here, I've just never heard anyone say, I'm heading to Geraldton, or I'd like to live in Geraldton. I've heard it about a lot of other places, whether I agree with that or not, and therefore I see the population growth. But this is one of those ones where I really do struggle with it, and I struggle with buyers agents pushing clients into areas where I'm sure they've never been to. I'm sure the buyer's agent's never taken a flight up or driven up to Geraldton. Because if they went there, they would ask the same questions I'm asking is, other than work in the government, what else are you doing there? Oakajee not a thing. We're not doing any capital works up there. We're not starting a new mine up there. So why are people moving there other than for the fact that, hey, it's cheap right now? Because at some point it stops being cheap right now, and then people are asking, well, what am I doing here? Yeah,
so the fundamentals that we'll be driving in terms of some of the other employment. So Eneabba and the Mineral Sands project out there in terms of Iluka is something will have attracted people to town. The other one is alternative fuel sources in terms of energy. And so we're talking wind and solar connection into Gero is quite significant. And so some people will have relocated to look into those scenarios. And then we go back to potentially the data center side of things. So when you marry up wind, solar power, and the energy required to run a data center, and the fact that Gero has one of the highest or the highest speed internet connection you can get in the country, then it creates some opportunity for some of those things to come together. And so some of the planning that goes into that and some of the construction that goes into that have begun to happen in town. And that's what's been those fundamental drivers for the Gero economy in the most recent past.
Well, that sounds like a construction project that at some point the arse falls out of. Again, I'm just bringing this up because the last thing I'd want people to do is to blindly go, that looks cheap, rents look good, I'll go to Gero.
Yep.
It's risky enough going to the northwest, going to Kalgoorlie, these places. We understand the risk and we balance them off against the rewards.
Yep.
And we make commentary on them to say, hey, actually, we think the rewards outweigh the risks in these places right now. It's a buy.
Yeah.
Or not.
Yeah.
I struggle still with that with Geraldton. Even if the prices are still less than what they are in other towns, they're now, 60, 70% more than they were 3 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So they were at a very low base as Gero struggled through. I think that renewable energy economy through there is something the local government and state government will push really, really hard. The comment from our local valuer on the ground up there is that demand far exceeds supply for homes under the $650,000 price point, and the rental market is at full capacity, as in there's no vacancy. And then we come back to supply. So essentially there is some vacant land available, and that's showing, so interesting part in the cycle here, they're only just starting to see vacant land values go up, and they go up when people get desperate for an affordable option to buy. And so
yeah, because the established market is now more expensive.
Established
than
market's
house and
getting
land
too
options.
expensive. There's a few builders in town. I'll go and have a look at the vacant land side of things. Then the only other, in terms of our experience of who moves to Geraldton, so I've had a lot of experience in the past of people moving from the Pilbara and from Carnarvon, Exmouth coast region up there to actually go down to Gero. So they don't want to move to Perth. They go to Donga or Geraldton as their lifestyle option. They've been regionally located in the past, and essentially it's a temperature change, lifestyle change situation. They want to get away from those 50-degree days
to 45.
and the humidity, and they go down to that dry heat and the daily sea breeze that comes through Gero. Yeah.
Let's go up the coast to Exmouth, mate. We haven't done that for a while.
Yeah, so I just thought we'd mention Exmouth on the way through because I got asked about it over a few Christmas drinks and some pressure on to mention it. But I have actually been doing a little bit of work up there, and just pretty amazing in terms of a small town that evolves and you see industry change. And so defence industry is really active in town. Rents are through the roof. I'm being told that if you have a furnished 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom modern dwelling available at the right period in time, i.e. when a tenant comes through town looking for something, that you could get as much as $1,500 a week for that. Essentially, there are overseas and interstate and state-based contractors coming into town to assist with a number of those defence type projects through town. And the reason I'm mentioning that in particular is obviously in the past it's been very much a tourist town, a fishing town in the past as well, and obviously always had that defence element to it with Learmonth and then with the Harold Holt base as well, 2 different facilities. And essentially what we're seeing there is the international investment that we've heard about, and maybe just to use a key term like your AUKUS type scenarios, and the tensions around the world in terms of what's happening from military build-up. Some of that money is flowing directly into this small town of Exmouth. Obviously, it's only there because of its military positioning during World War II and post. So it's really interesting to see that industry start to interact with the tourism industry and the locals that have been there for a period of time. That's obviously putting a lot of pressure on house values, but obviously also putting a lot of pressure on rental values. And we get back to good old demand and supply. We've done some work in the location in the past. The state government owns some subdivisible or in Globo land that is attached to town, but it's simply too expensive to get that out of the ground and create the supply.
So is it a willy-nilly investment buy, or is it one where you think there has to be a secondary reason you'd buy it, like a holiday home?
I would prefer that second option in terms of being solid. You might buy it and rent it out in the short term to lock away your mortgage, get your return, get some tax write-offs, do things like tax depreciation schedules on it and that kind of stuff, with a view to being able to settle there into the future or use it as a holiday home once it becomes financially more viable. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Karratha.
On to Karratha, and we hit the Pilbara. Interesting to watch these locations go through their little bit of cycle up and down. Karratha's had a surge in demand. Investors are back in that market. And when I say these things, we're not talking about the old days of everyone's going to Karratha to buy a property, but essentially it is some East Coast investors looking around, some Perth investors, and probably some buyer agents looking around for yields.
Really? This is interesting because the last 12 months of your commentary on Karratha has essentially been it's not much to report.
Yep.
It's pretty stable. The locals are buying good product when they can.
Yep.
But otherwise, we're just chuffing along, not really sure where the iron ore price is going to go. Otherwise, it's pretty stable.
Yeah.
You're saying that things have picked up.
Picked up. Again, it's not a boom and bust type cycle. It's just a surge in activity. Really interestingly, we've seen apartments be part of that purchase scenario. Rents are still really significant in terms of holding up really high. Clearly, investors will be coming to look at that. They'll be looking at 10% plus returns, those types of scenarios. But also, as we've been talking about with other regional locations, there's lots of people moving to town at the start of 2025. So really good demand for rentals. So essentially, what we're going through there is, if a family's going to relocate to Karratha for 2025, they're trying to do it right now because they want to get involved in the school year and get the kids settled down in town. So good surge at the start of the year there, and a lot of underlying different type of activity happening through Karratha, not just oil and gas, not just iron ore. There's a few other alternative type industries coming through there. And again, a city that's been well served by investment from the state government, capitalising on the fact that investment's been made.
Again, interesting to hear that. For me, I'd be super nervous going up to Karratha and investing in it right now, given the global tensions and concerns about where China's going. No one seems to know where it's going right now, and I think Karratha is pretty tightly aligned and correlated with where China heads. I think it's one, if you've got a property in Karratha, keep it, keep cracking on, enjoy the returns. But I don't know if I'd be putting my new money into Karratha right now.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of other factors that people need to be aware of when they're investing in the northwest and when you get into those cyclone area locations. And that is, in particular, when you're buying strata property, insurance is really difficult in terms of strata title property in the Pilbara, and insurance for a single residential dwelling. As we're speaking, there's some issues in California in terms of significant insurance events because of the fires over there. That will have repercussions around the world in terms of putting price pressure on premiums. So just be wary of that when you're getting a return post 10%, higher than 10%, that part of that return is for the risk you're taking and the cost that you're taking on in terms of owning that property.
Let's go to Headland and finish it off.
Values are really stable in Port Hedland and South Hedland at this point in time. In fact, our valuer on the ground there is essentially saying that Port Hedland has come back a little. It has had a buyback scheme going over the last couple of years, and that's coming towards the end of that scheme. And so that will have taken a little bit of sting out of that market in terms of one source of demand for sellers. South Hedland's still got a large volume of sales happening, but values are essentially pretty steady. So a bit of churn going on there and a little bit of supply creating the ability to essentially transact and not drive values up. Price pressure is not there at this point in the cycle, which, if we stand back from it, is actually what you're trying to look for in lots of markets. Like, we don't want to always be sitting here.
Market
So
point, right?
Unlike the rest of WA, that market's got enough supply to drive or fill up or satisfy the demand that's coming through.
So is it weakening, or is it simply just the similar story to Karratha in 2024?
Yeah, so, certainly Hedland and Port Hedland are transacting, South Hedland and Port Hedland transacting. I would expect that if there is any significant change in terms of projects there and demand goes up slightly for housing, then we'll see that upward trajectory. But essentially, it's in a bit of a holding pattern in terms of value growth at this point in time.
Brendo, thanks so much for that update on the regions. It's been a long one, this one, but I think we had a lot of interest, a lot of things to talk about here, and again, juxtaposing that against the Perth market and how and why this is happening, and how and why prices could go up or could go down in certain markets, because more and more people are becoming more interested, clearly, in buying property somewhere in the regions in WA. So appreciate your time, as do the listeners. Again, the most popular man on the podcast every year. We'll hopefully see you again with a regional update in April.
Cheers, Trent. Thanks for having me, and let's hope 2025 is really good for everybody.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!